Good afternoon again, everyone. I'm Adam Elwanger, Associate Professor of Rhetoric at University of Houston downtown. Yesterday I posted a brief lecture on sort of some of the larger themes of Aristotle's text On Rhetoric. This afternoon I want to return to another of the focuses in the text, but to treat it in more detail. And that is the difference between what Aristotle calls a syllogism and an enthymeme. Now, both of these are ways to prove an argument. Any argument. You can prove any argument as a syllogism. You can prove any argument as an enthymeme. They differ somewhat in how they prove the argument. And the stakes differ for each one as well. We've established that Aristotle sets up a distinction between dialectic on the one hand and rhetoric on the other. He says that rhetoric is the counter part of dialectic. So what he means, and we could discuss this, we discussed it a little bit in the last video though, is that dialectic generally has a greater capacity to prove knowable, demonstrable truth. And of course, being a Platonist to some extent or another, that's what Aristotle's after. Aristotle sees the pursuit of truth as a higher calling than sophistic rhetoric, which is just kind of a manipulation of people's beliefs. And so dialectic for Aristotle is uniquely aligned with the syllogism as a method of proof. In contrast, rhetoric seems to be aligned more with the enthymeme, which Aristotle sometimes calls a rhetorical syllogism. Now, why is the syllogism aligned with rhetoric? Well, we'll discuss that as we go along, but it's important now to note that for Aristotle, rhetoric's utility, its usefulness, lies in the fact that it is a tool for probabilistic truth, finding probable truth, finding a way to take a stance on a question that doesn't allow a clear determination of the truth. And last time we talked about examples of political questions. Today, as we walk through the difference between the enthymeme and the syllogism, I want to focus on another political question, one that's pressing on American democracy right now. Should we build a wall? Right? And as I said in the last video, I don't think that either side can exhaustively, demonstrably prove the truth of their claim. In other words, there's good arguments for not making a wall. We can cite those, but ultimately we can't prove that the true correct position is not to build a wall. In contrast, there's good arguments for making a wall, right? But at the same time, we could cite evidence that demonstrates some of the reasons why we might want to build a wall, but we can't exhaustively, definitively prove that a wall should be built. Okay? So before we get to this syllogism that I have on the board, let's look at some of these passages from the Rhetoric where Aristotle talks specifically about the difference between the syllogism and the enthymeme. So if you begin on page 182 in the rhetorical tradition, this is in the second column, about an inch down. And I'm going to read at length and stop periodically to comment on some of this stuff. So he says, with regard to the persuasion achieved by the proof or the apparent proof, just as in dialectic there is induction on the one hand and syllogism or apparent syllogism on the other, so it is in rhetoric. The example is an induction. The enthymeme is a syllogism. And the apparent enthymeme is an apparent syllogism. I call the enthymeme a rhetorical syllogism, and the example a rhetorical induction. Everyone who affects persuasion through proof does in fact use either enthymemes or examples. There's no other way. Okay, so let's pause there for a moment. And I think it's important to note that he's talking about apparent syllogisms, apparent proofs. And sometimes the apparent proof is as close as we can get to a true proof, right? Sometimes someone appears to have proven something, but on closer scrutiny, it doesn't really exhaustively demonstrate it. And we'll talk some more about that. We're going to skip a few lines here and go down from where we just finished, maybe about 16 lines. He eventually says, now let's skip 10 lines, right? And he continues, when we base the proof of a claim on a number of similar cases, this is induction in dialectic, example in rhetoric. And when it is shown that certain propositions being true, a further and quite distinct proposition might also be true in consequence, whether invariably or usually. This is called syllogism in dialectic and enthymeme in rhetoric. It is plain also that each of these types of oratory has its advantages. All right, this is important, and we're going to return to this idea of if anything can be proven either syllogistically or enthymematically, then how do we choose which to use? How do we choose whether to prove it with a syllogism or prove it with an enthymeme? Well, there's different costs and benefits to each of those choices, and we'll talk some more about those in a moment. Skip over to the next page, the first column, about 3 lines down in the first column, page 183. He says, a statement is persuasive and credible either because it is directly self-evident or because it appears to be proved from other statements that are self-evident. In either case, it is persuasive because there's somebody who persuades and somebody whom it persuades. But none of the arts theorize about individual cases. Medicine, for instance, does not theorize about what will help to cure Socrates or Callias, but only about what will help to cure any or all of a given class of patients. This alone is its business. Individual cases are so infinitely various that no systemic knowledge of them is possible. In the same way, the theory of rhetoric is concerned not with what seems probable to a given individual, like Socrates or Hippias, but with what seems probable to men of a given type. That's ethos, right? What is persuasive to a certain class of person, a certain type of person? Dialectic does not construct its syllogisms out of any haphazard materials, such as the fancies of crazy people, but out of materials that call for discussion. And rhetoric, too, draws upon the regular subjects of debate. The duty of rhetoric is to deal with such matters as we deliberate upon without arts or systems to guide us. In the hearing of persons who cannot take at a glance a complicated argument or follow a long chain of reasoning. All right, a few things here. One, remember our discussions of theoria versus praxis. That's theory and practice, right? And in this passage, we see Aristotle getting precisely at the theoretical job of rhetoric. So just like in medicine, they don't say, well, geez, what will cure Adam Ellwanger, right? They say, well, what will cure people in general who get the flu or whatever, right? And that's because the possibilities for individual cases is too many and too varied to proceed that way with any high probability for success. And so in other words, we abstract general principles, right? And he says that this is very similar to rhetoric, right? And that rhetoric doesn't address itself to a particular audience member. It addresses itself to particular classes of audience members. And so, again, we can come up with general theoretical principles about how rhetoric works, with the full knowledge that in practice, the individual possibilities of the situation are simply so varied that our theoretical knowledge might not apply. This is the tension between theory and practice. Theory enables us to prepare for rhetorical practice, but rhetorical practice is what allows us to refine theory, right? When we say, well, generally this is true about rhetoric, but yesterday when I talked to my mailman, it didn't seem to work that way. What's the hole in the theory over here that we can fix to account, perhaps, for this thing with the mailman? Okay. Second thing I want to look at in the passage we just read is he says that some people are unable to take in at a glance a long, complicated argument or a long chain of reasoning. Now, this returns to the anti-democratic impulses that we saw in Plato and that we saw in Aristotle. Well, we're seeing it here in Aristotle, right? The idea is that people are stupid, right? And most of the time, right, if you say, like, look, I'm going to prove this to you, but there's 26 premises. Can you just take a seat and I'll give my presentation about how this is true? Most audiences are going to say, first off, I'm not willing to listen to you go through 26 premises. Second off, most audiences, by the time you get to premise 8, they've forgotten about premise 2, right? They're not practiced in following logical, syllogistic structures that might go on at length. And so, Aristotle recognizes that even though the syllogism is the more logical way to proceed, the way that perhaps is more aligned with real epistemological truth, it nevertheless is not necessarily the most powerful means to persuade someone. Okay. Let's continue reading. It is possible to form syllogisms and draw conclusions from the results of previous syllogisms, or, on the other hand, from premises which have not been thus proved, and at the same time are so little accepted that they call for proof. Reasonings of the former kind will necessarily be hard to follow owing to their length. For we assume an audience of untrained thinkers. Those of the latter kind will fail to win assent, because they are based on premises that are not generally admitted or believed. And so it seems here that Aristotle concedes the idea that the sophists have about where rhetoric operates, and where it operates is before the untrained masses, right? And so doxa, public opinion, and these sorts of things are going to have a very powerful role in whether or not we prove things. So let's keep going, and I promise we're almost done reading for a few minutes. Go to the next column, 183. First paragraph, second column, 183. The enthymeme and the example must then deal with what is in the main contingent, the example being an induction, and the enthymeme a syllogism about such matters. The enthymeme must consist of few propositions, fewer often than those which make up the normal syllogism. For if any of these propositions is a familiar fact, there's no need to even mention it. The hearer adds it himself. All right. Well, he gives an example then. Thus, to show that Dorius has been victor in a contest for which the prize is a crown, it's enough to say, for he's been victor in the Olympic Games, without adding, and in the Olympic Games the prize is a crown, because everybody knows that fact. Okay. So, we now have that the enthymeme is a shorter, compressed kind of syllogism. Okay, and we will return to that because it's shorter and condensed. It may be more effective for working with large audiences of people who maybe aren't really trained in logic or reasoning or rhetoric or philosophy or anything really. And of course, that's the case we're often working in democracy. Where everybody, regardless of preparation, is enfranchised. That, of course, wasn't really the case in ancient Greeks, but it's true to a much larger degree in the United States. I'm sure that you've met someone before where you're like, I can't believe this person votes, right? So anyways, let's start with the syllogism, okay? Here's an example of a syllogism, right? And I just want to walk through it, right? And I think that in the little description of the video on YouTube, I will type it up so that you can look at it as you watch the video. And so there will be another opportunity, or there should be one right now, to look down in the description. But let's walk through it. So here's the syllogism, an attempt to prove a claim, right? Let's look at the final claim that we're trying to produce. It might be hard to read from where you are. It says, the U.S. government should build a wall at the southern border. Okay, so that's the claim that we're trying to arrive at. And so we've built here a logical syllogistic structure that all leads to that conclusion. So let's read through it. Premise 1, sovereignty is a precondition of nationhood. Sovereignty means the ability to make decisions on your own, right, without the influence of others. Sovereignty is a precondition of nationhood. Our second premise is recognized borders are a precondition of sovereignty. In other words, if you don't have a border that delineates who is in and who is out, then the notion of sovereignty, the ability to make decisions on your own, is threatened. And so we draw our first conclusion here, that recognized borders are a precondition of nationhood. Right? In other words, this conclusion follows from these two premises. Right? It just does. Right? You don't have to believe this conclusion. That's fine. You can say, well, no, borders aren't important for nationhood. But if you accept this premise and you accept this premise, then you must accept this premise, because this premise is the product of those two premises. So let's let conclusion 1 sit on the back burner here for a minute. 3, mass illegal immigration undermines the status of America's borders and sovereignty. And then we draw a second conclusion, right? Mass illegal immigration is a threat to American nationhood. And so now we've established the problem, right? Mass illegal immigration is a threat to American nationhood. And then we move on to a fourth premise. The U.S. government has an obligation to address threats to the nation, right? And of course, with each of these premises, if pressed by an audience, we could provide evidence to demonstrate the truth of each of these. For example, I could point to the nation's founding documents which show that one of the fundamental purposes of government is to take care of and ensure the legitimacy of America's borders. And so the new premise is the United States government has an obligation to address threats to the nation. We've already proven that illegal immigration back here is a threat to the nation, right? And so this allows us to draw our third conclusion. The U.S. government is obligated to address illegal immigration. Okay. So there's our third conclusion. Now we've got another series of premises here, and I'll read them. The fifth premise: deportation is immoral and impractical. Okay. We can make an argument for that. All right. 6, detainment is immoral and impractical. All right. 7, asking people for proof of immigration status is immoral and impractical. Okay. 8, incarceration is immoral and impractical. 9, open borders annihilate sovereign nationhood. So in other words, the solution can't be just to do away with borders, because that does away with the nation, right? 10, self-deportation did not occur. Mitt Romney argued in his presidential campaign that people would self-deport given changes to the U.S. economy. Doesn't seem to have happened about a decade on. 11, separating families is immoral and impractical, right? And now we get to our final conclusion. Conclusion 4, the U.S. government should build a wall at the southern border. This conclusion hinges on the fact that A, we must do something about illegal immigration, but also concedes to the critics of American immigration policy that we can't do any of this stuff. So if we can't do any of this stuff, and yet we are obligated to address it, then the only remaining solution seems to be to build a wall, right? And so it's given the unwillingness to take any of these alternative solutions, this becomes the solution by default. Okay, are you convinced? I don't know. I think it probably depends a lot on who you voted for, right? And what your pre-existing attitudes about these topics are. But I think that I have syllogistically created a proof for this claim that we should build a wall. Now, if you accept all of these premises, then you probably must accept this conclusion because it follows from those premises. And yet, there are certainly ways, right, that you could avoid drawing the final conclusion here, right? In other words, you can say, well, it's not true that mass illegal immigration undermines the status of America's borders and sovereignty, right? You could attack individual premises or perhaps individual conclusions, right? And so, just because it's stated as fact, as truth, doesn't mean that there's not a counter-argument for some of this, right? And in fact, some people who are border control advocates might say, well, actually, detainment is not immoral and impractical, and it's a preferred solution to a wall, or whatever, right? But what we have here is an attempt to persuade an audience of this particular conclusion. You'll also notice it's very long and involved, right? And if you're like me, most people that you know, when you start arguing border security, aren't going to allow you to set up your little whiteboard and walk them through however many things this is, 15, 16 interlocking premises and conclusions. It's just not the way most people are persuaded. In fact, even if the syllogism is good and you break it out, some people might be just like, come on, man, I don't want to watch your presentation. Just make an argument. So we ask ourselves, what then would an enthymeme look like in contrast to a syllogism? Well, write down this enthymeme in your notebook if you're following along. The U.S. government should build a wall at the southern border because mass illegal immigration is a threat to American nationhood. Right? And what we just did was combine this conclusion with an earlier conclusion, except here we're stating this earlier conclusion as the reason that guarantees our conclusion. So the claim is the government should build a wall at the southern border. The stated reason is because mass illegal immigration is a threat to American nationhood. Right? Now, Aristotle, which one does he like better? Enthymeme or syllogism? And remember, he said, well, both have costs and gains. So let's talk about how the enthymeme works. You'll note that, I wish I had two whiteboards. I don't want to erase this, though, because I need to type this up for you when I upload the video. So we're kind of screwed. But let's think about that enthymeme, right? The U.S. should build a wall at the southern border because mass illegal immigration is a threat to American nationhood. That enthymeme depends on an unstated premise. An unstated premise. And I'll give you a minute to think about it. Can you think of what unstated premise that enthymeme relies upon? The enthymeme is the U.S. government should build a wall at the southern border because mass illegal immigration undermines the status of America's borders. Or rather, is a threat to American nationhood, right? Can you think of the unstated premise that enthymeme depends on? Well, the unstated premise is that the United States government has an obligation to address threats to American nationhood, right? If you don't believe that, if you don't believe that the American government has an obligation to respond to threats to American nationhood, then that enthymeme will not be persuasive, right, to you, because it's hinging on an unstated premise that you do not agree with. However, there's some benefits to this unstated premise. So let's talk about them. All right. Remember, Aristotle says that the enthymeme is a compressed or condensed or truncated syllogism. In other words, we just took a 16 or whatever premise argument and turned it into one sentence. And much of what is up here is still operative in the enthymeme. It's just packed inside of it invisibly, right? Now, what are the advantages to the enthymeme? Well, one is that it's short and sweet, and audiences will listen and respond to that, right? But a second one is that it can hide its contents, right? Just like a number of these premises were still operative in that enthymeme, they were not visible. They were unstated. They were packed in between the claim and the stated reason invisibly, if you will. Now, why is this a benefit? Well, it's a benefit because sometimes the claim that you're advancing or your reasons for a claim aren't reasons that you want to state explicitly, right? And so you get to hide it and conceal it in the structure of the enthymeme. Here's another benefit. Another benefit is that often audiences can't put their finger on the unstated premise of the enthymeme, right? Which the whole enthymeme depends on. And so it makes it harder to refute, right? If I tell you, the U.S. government should build a wall at the southern border because mass illegal immigration is a threat to American nationhood, right? If you're going to disprove that, you need to say, no, illegal immigration isn't a problem, right? But you never touch at this question of whether or not a government has an obligation, a moral or ethical obligation, to respond to threats to sovereignty. And so, oftentimes it's a way to kind of pull the wool over your audience's eyes if they're inclined to disagree with your enthymeme. But here's the one that Aristotle seems to celebrate in this passage that we read here. Remember, he says the audience, the hearer, adds the unstated premise himself. Right? So let's think about this for a second. Let's say that when I say my enthymeme, the U.S. government should build a wall because mass illegal immigration is a threat to American nationhood. Let's say you hear that claim and you say, yeah, right? Well, that's because you are supplying and validating that unstated claim that the United States has an obligation to address threats to its nationhood. And so if, I drop that out because it's already accepted, and I think we probably do agree that the United States has an obligation to address threats to its nationhood, right, by the founding documents of the nation. Now you could say, yeah, but this isn't on a threat to the nationhood, really. Okay, but that's different, right? In principle, we probably agree that threats to the nationhood, to our nationhood, need to be addressed by the government. Okay, and so the fact that that idea, that unstated premise, is so broadly accepted by people, what it does is immediately build a connection between you and I. When I leave it out, I assume that you already know and agree with that, right? And further, when you realize that I've left it out, if you agree with it, then you're like, yeah, I like this guy. He knows, right? And we share this thing that doesn't even need to be stated. However, right, if you disagree with the unstated premise, I've already assumed that you agree with it by leaving it unstated. I don't even need to bring that up. Of course you agree with that, right? Well, maybe not. But when it's unstated, most audiences have a harder time saying, well, your enthymeme or your argument assumed that I believe something that I don't believe, and it's this, right? That takes a certain degree of boldness to take the thing that the speaker suggests everybody already agreed upon that doesn't need to be discussed, and you say, actually, I'm not one of the many that agrees with this. I think that we have a problem there. Now, one of the problems with the enthymeme is that you can't state as much evidence explicitly because it's brief, right? You can't lead the audience inevitably to a certain conclusion. So that's syllogism and enthymeme. Syllogism, the long drawn out rhetorical or rather logical structure of a proof. versus the enthymeme, the rhetorically condensed or abbreviated, truncated, brief rhetorical argument. All right, I hope you enjoyed. If you have questions, leave them in the comments or whatever. Super Bowl in just a couple hours. Here's my prediction. We're going to go Rams 30, Patriots 22. Enjoy it.